Hello everyone, and welcome to EBACE Connect. Thank you for taking a portion of your day to learn with us. Please note, public chat is open. We encourage you to interact with your peers as you enjoy the session. This session is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand 24 hours after it concludes in the EBACE Connect platform. And with that, let's get started.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to EBACE Connect. On behalf of the organizers, the European Business Aviation Association and the National Business Aviation Association, I can say that we're very happy to bring EBACE virtually back this year, with all the educational content you've been accustomed to over the years. European in name, but global by nature, EBACE has always gathered the greatest minds, innovations, and experts from the business aviation industry. As we gather over the next 3 days for EBACE Connect, that is something that we're looking forward to bringing back. The sharing of knowledge, best practices, and the melting of minds is how the business aviation industry has been able to become as adaptable, resilient, and pioneering as it is today. Over the next 3 days, we'll hear from market leaders on post-COVID operations and what factors can drive further growth in the industry. We'll learn from some of the cutting-edge pioneering advancements in advanced air mobility, discuss with the heads of the largest OEMs in business aviation on their visions for the future of our industry. We'll explore sustainable technologies and the readiness of hydrogen and electrification. And finally, share best practices in the realm of safety and tech. But before we get into that, I'm excited to introduce to you today's opening keynote, kindly sponsored by UAS International Trip Support.
Hello, I am Mohammed Husain, co-founder, executive president of UAS International Trip Support. The past 14 months have seen aviation face the greatest challenge of its history. But despite this, we have demonstrated incredible endurance, resilience, and shown the power of our pioneering spirit. Going forward, it's going to be our collective expertise and innovation that will ensure we have the strongest recovery. It is for these reasons I believe this EBACE Connect is probably the most important EBACE we've ever attended. I look forward to our discussions ahead. I'm looking forward to doing business with all of you in the near future.
An exciting interview with pioneering aviator and entrepreneur Erik Lindbergh. So please join my friend and colleague, NBAA President and CEO Ed Bolen, for a forward-looking conversation with Erik Lindbergh at the Museum of Flight in Seattle.
Well, thank you, Athar, and welcome everybody to EBACE Connect, our opportunity to spend 2 days together talking about all things business aviation. Our keynote speaker today is Erik Lindbergh, a name synonymous with aviation and sustainability. And we'll be talking today from the Museum of Flight in Seattle about how we set the foundation to move forward with business aviation and all aviation in the future.
Almost 100 years ago, on a dark morning that seemed to hold no promise, a small plane was getting ready for takeoff on a muddy field in New York. The plane was heavy with fuel and the runway was soft, so people pushed. The plane moved slowly. As it struggled, the people kept pushing. The plane gathered momentum. The people kept pushing. Finally, the plane moved faster than they could run. They let it go. Charles Lindbergh was on his way to Paris, and a whole new era of human life on this planet had begun. At the Lindbergh Foundation, we know great dreams can come true, and that even on the darkest mornings, that promise remains. So in honor of the 100th anniversary of the flight that gave wings to us all, this foundation will be like the people who pushed that little plane toward the sky. Our dream is to help lift hopes of a better tomorrow out of the mud and set them on their valiant way.
We are more than honored to have Erik Lindbergh with us. Erik, I wanted to start today by talking a little bit about the motivation for your grandfather's epic flight from New York to Paris. Your grandfather, among a lot of other people in the world, was motivated by a French hotelier named Raymond Ortigue, who created a prize, $25,000 prize, in 1919. 1927, your grandfather is able to accomplish that and fire the imagination of the world. Can you talk a little bit about the role that prizes play in motivating people to think beyond today's constraints and imagine doing what seems impossible?
Oh, yeah. Before my grandfather flew across the Atlantic in 1927 for that prize, people who flew across in airplanes were called barnstormers and daredevils. And after he flew across the Atlantic, people who flew in airplanes were called pilots and passengers. And it was a huge shift in the world's perspective about what aviation could be used for. I think as we look back on that today and we think about what the future holds and how we're going to get there, how we're going to fly into the future, sustainability and the ultimate connection that aviation gives us is really what we need to intersect with. And prize philanthropy is the absolute perfect medium to do that with. Using prizes to help create new technologies or break through barriers and challenges that we're facing is an excellent tool.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring that up because you obviously flew your own 75th anniversary flight. And what you did was you were able to generate over $1 million that was then used for the XPRIZE and ultimately help launch what we now recognize as commercial space. Do you want to talk about your motivation and how meaningful it must have been to use that same incentive to commemorate the 75th anniversary of that transatlantic flight?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit of background. Peter Diamandis was an aspiring astronaut wannabe, and he read my grandfather's book, The Spirit of St. Louis, and went, oh, that's how we'll do it. We'll put up a prize. Just like the first prize to fly from New York to Paris, and we'll do it for space, $10 million. And the first team that flies suborbitally, returns, does it again within 2 weeks, showing it's reusable, wins the largest cash prize in history. And it worked. It should have failed. It was really hard. It was a great idea. But he approached me and a whole passel of Apollo astronauts and Dan Golden, the head of NASA, all to sort of put together this super credibility around this idea. And I thought, Peter, this is interesting. $10 million, but we're going to send it off into space. Couldn't we use that $10 million here on Earth? And as he and astronaut Byron Lichtenberg worked on me to try to get me behind this thing, I realized, yeah, this is incredibly important, and it's such a motivational tool to break through the challenges that we weren't seeing governments and big business interested in getting the common person into space and starting to really realize the benefits of space. So that was the history behind XPRIZE, and it eventually succeeded, and my flight was one of those areas where we raised $1 million, another $1 million in kind, and 500 million media impressions before social media, so that was really a thing. It made it work, and it made the world really shift its perspective on what spaceflight could be and be for us, and maybe we can realize the benefits of doing heavy industry in space as this private spaceflight industry grows.
Yeah, and I think I read with your grandfather, the prize itself, $25,000, was one thing, but 10 to 20 times that amount of money was being spent by the community trying to find ways to win the prize. So it really unleashed a huge amount of funding for a vision that was very clearly articulated.
Yeah, and I think the secret behind prizes is to have them be as simple as possible with as few restrictions as possible, but you've got to design it carefully so someone doesn't game it and win it on a technicality, because what you really want is the development behind it. So we really wanted to basically jumpstart the private spaceflight industry. It worked. We're seeing Musk and Bezos and Branson all vying to have self-floating carbon-based payloads like us, buy a ticket and fly into space, and that is so exciting.
Well, let me keep going with the prize, because I understand now you're working on an XPRIZE that is imagining decarbonizing the atmosphere. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, XPRIZE Foundation gets together usually every year, and we have what we call visioneering, and we put forth new prize design ideas, and then we vet them, and we have rigorous sort of competitions based on the group of brilliant entrepreneurs of our time in these rooms, figuring out what are the breakthroughs we need to see, and can we apply prize philanthropy to those. So everyone keeps coming back to, we have all these great prize designs, but the carbon issue keeps coming back harder and harder. Well, what do we do about that? It's such a massive problem. Could we even do that? So we've been studying how to do carbon prizes, and we've actually run a very successful one using the effluent from coal plants to create products that you could sell. And that's been a great exercise for us over the last 8 years. And then we're like, okay, well, how do we do this better? How do we scale this to a global prize? And we had about 6 months of planning and getting ready and really starting to pitch this, and COVID happened. We backed off. What's going on? Aviation sort of shut down. Meanwhile, Elon Musk steps up and says, I'm putting $100 million behind this prize, the largest suite of cash prizes in history. And so, okay, this is great, we've got it. But aviation still has this issue, right? So the Lindbergh Foundation is now teaming up with XPRIZE to do what we're calling ForeverFlight Alliance. And that is to ask the question, how do we make aviation infinitely sustainable? And where can we do it first, and how do we scale it? How do we bring it to commercial viability? So we're building the brain trust right now to figure out how we can both get to net zero carbon flight and true zero carbon flight. So those are the two kind of big areas. Eventually we'll work on noise as another issue, because they're just threats facing aviation. We're building the brain trust, bringing in folks such as yourselves and NBAA, and others in the industry who can help identify where the challenges and the barriers are, and then look at the potential prizes that we can use to try to overcome those barriers. And then the metrics and the standards and the regulatory environment and so forth, so that we can drive that dialogue from the left seat, the pilot seat. And we're not just sitting in the back waiting for something to happen, which we might not like as an industry.
Well, we've talked a lot about sustainability. I want to go back to what that means in your family, because obviously your grandmother, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was not only a great pilot and pioneer. I think she had the first female to ever get a first-class glider's license. She soloed in 1930, for goodness sakes, and helped open a lot of routes all around the world. In addition to that, it was her 1950s book, Gift from the Sea, that really helped start the environmental movement. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, my grandmother was an extraordinary woman, and she combined that sort of her ability to fly and be an excellent stick, as they say. She was an excellent pilot, had a great touch in those old airplanes that were hard to fly. As a radio operator, when you had to change the tubes and roll out the right length of antenna to communicate with when they did the survey routes north to the Orient and through Europe in the early 1930s. So she had this incredible technical ability and a great touch, and then she wrote about it too. So she took you on these adventures. And as her life went on, and my grandparents both really saw the Earth from above, from the 20s to the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and really saw the changes that our technology that we used could have on our environment, and realized that we needed to have balance. And so when she articulates that in her books like Earthshine and Gift from the Sea, you really just understand that she was way ahead of her time. And Gift from the Sea still sells like 20,000 copies a year today, 50 years later after it was published. So I think people pay a lot of attention to my grandfather, but my grandmother was the true heroine in the family.
I also think it's interesting you talk about your grandparents seeing the world from above, because we all have been blessed to meet some astronauts who talk about looking down and seeing just how fragile the Earth looks and how indeed it's an Earth that's in balance.
Right. You know, working with all the space geeks at the XPRIZE Foundation and the astronauts, and meeting Neil Armstrong and Jim Lovell and Gene Cernan. I mean, these guys, so amazing. And what I really came to understand is that the Earth is the only sustainable spaceship that we have. It's a spaceship, we're out in space. And yet we survive on it. And so how do we make sure that this survives until our technology allows us to go find another habitable planet? It could be a long time, and Europe is leading the way in sustainability issues, and that's an extraordinary thing, because it gives us in the United States a view towards what's going to happen in the future, so we can predict a little bit better what's coming towards us, and we need to move in that direction. So thank you to all of you that are doing this great work.
You know, as we talk about kind of the future of aviation, in a lot of ways it pulls back to who we are. We've always been about on-demand air mobility, that ability to get people where they need to be when they need to be there. And whether we're doing it through electric propulsion, hydrogen propulsion, or with sustainable aviation fuel, it's always about bringing people where they need to be when they need to be there.
You know, Ed, I think this is the most extraordinary and exciting time that I've ever seen in aviation in my career. And airlines are hurting right now because of the COVID pandemic, but cargo's doing great. Business aviation has recovered well and is thriving, and there's some bright spots there. But the advent of electric propulsion, and distributed electric propulsion in particular, being able to put thrust anywhere you want to along an airframe, gives you the potential to come up with completely novel applications and missions. So you can do electric vertical takeoff and landing. Very, very exciting. Or electric short takeoff and landing for cargo delivery. And what this is going to do over the next 5 to 10 years is dramatically change the way that we move around the planet, short and medium distances. It's going to take a while for it to get there for the bigger aircraft and faster, longer missions.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what we are doing on the longer, further, faster missions, and that is the advent of sustainable aviation fuel.
Sure.
The opportunity to use SAF and dramatically reduce our carbon footprint. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're looking at this as a kind of step function for even the use of fossil fuels?
Absolutely. We need to look at everywhere we can gain efficiency, and aviation's really good at doing that. We gain 1% of efficiency on an airframe, and it translates into thousands of gallons, millions of gallons of fuel. But utilizing new fuels, sustainable aviation fuel, biofuels, and potentially hydrogen and other alternative fuels and alternative propulsion like ammonia fuels can be possible. Those are a little more bleeding edge or new and unproven, but sustainable aviation fuels have shifted. There was a real push towards using palm fuels, and that has a negative environmental impact. And now there are more and more companies that are taking fuel stocks, and those are more sustainable. So we absolutely need to invest in those technologies so that we can use them in the existing fleets that we have. Aviation, it's an incredible tool for all the reasons you said, to get there when you need to for business. Everybody relies on them for packages, et cetera. But we absolutely have to have it, and we have these fixed assets that are going to be good for 30 years. So using sustainable aviation fuels is the bridge until we get those hydrogen fuels and ammonias and the crazy batteries that are going to come that'll give us that propulsion. Well, we've got to utilize what we have right now and slowly make that transition. And we need that investment.
Yeah, and I think business aviation is kind of uniquely positioned to embrace that. You know, business aviation, we were early adopters of GPS technology, new technology that allowed more direct routing. Right. We were early adopters of composite technologies. You and I have the opportunity to overlook a Lear fan, which effectively was a early carbon fiber type of aircraft. Winglets and other types of propulsion advances. But being able to make the fuel itself sustainable, that's a quantum leap forward.
Yeah, it's huge, and we're making great strides now. So I'm pretty excited about biofuels and sustainable aviation fuel as that terminology is shifting to be more sustainable. And there's more. I mean, aviation, we're now starting to use AI in aviation, and we're starting to have these unique airframes and unique mission profiles that we can do with distributed electric propulsion. That's what makes aviation so exciting to me these days.
Erik, I'm glad you brought up artificial intelligence, or AI, because that's clearly changing industries all around the world, but it's having a particular impact on our industry through things as simple as just charter brokerage. Can you talk a little bit about the company that you're involved with?
Oh, absolutely. The Lindbergh Foundation does these Lindbergh Innovation Forums at AirVenture and Aero Friedrichshafen and other shows. And we had a speaker by the name of Richard Kane who talked about AI in aviation. And you'd think it would be this super technical thing that nobody could understand, but he humanized it. And so that was 2 years ago. Now he's launched a company called Verajet. I serve on the board. And the promise of this is that you can book your charter aircraft on your phone. It's cheaper, it uses single pilot, because they're using the Cirrus Vision Jet, which has this extraordinary capability. I think it's AI based, but you push the button and it'll go auto land in an emergency. Extraordinary capability. And with a single pilot, it's cheaper, and the mission, 500 miles is the optimum mission, so go a little further, a little less, but using that aircraft saves tons of carbon on every flight. So as we start to realize the benefits of AI, both for scheduling, dispatch, safety, maintenance, and our using it as a human interface, it's going to dramatically change the way we move around the planet, and that's just super exciting to see those efficiencies coming along. That's where technology can really help us with our quality of life.
Yeah, and I think the idea of matching the aircraft to the mission is one of the things that we're talking about a lot, using advanced air mobility from city centers to secondary or maybe tertiary airports, and then being able to go halfway around the world, potentially using sustainable aviation fuel. It's a change in the way we're thinking about that on-demand air mobility.
Absolutely. And that sort of development of, let's just say that most of us got into aviation or exposed to it by small airplanes, general aviation. We learned to become a pilot flying a Cessna or a Piper. And there are charter organizations that will charter small airplanes like that, but aviation has never lived up, I think, to the promise of short to middle distance charter and transportation like it's going to in the next few years. It's really going to change. With the advent of electric vertical takeoff capability, urban air mobility, we are going to see that sort of small aircraft with multi-mission roles and cargo that are going to really fill that gap between the charter operators who are flying from New York to Seattle, for example, and then be able to fly you to Mercer Island in a small urban air mobility vehicle. that's a huge change, and it's coming very, very quickly, and I think it's going to change the way we fly anymore.
So I forgot you worked for a charter service in London. You want to talk a little bit about your experience living abroad and kind of what it means to be an international citizen in this kind of global world today that we have an ability to both shrink but also make sustainable?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot about the charter industry from working for Air Charter Service out of London, and I didn't live there permanently, but I was back and forth a lot, and charter brings the world together. It also helps in all kinds of industry to move cargo and aid all around the world, and I learned these operations are incredibly complex. The permissions are hard to get, and yet these guys do it as a matter of course every day, and they're moving. I think, the most impressive part was the aid. This company started by sending grain to Ethiopia using old surplus Russian transport planes to help the famine in Ethiopia. And it's morphed into this global business that's doing logistics all over the planet. Both people and cargo and more. And that, I don't see us going backwards. So we need to make it sustainable as we can and gain those efficiencies of artificial intelligence and aircraft design that will enable this industry to be more sustainable, because we're facing a lot of pressure. We have a very small fraction of carbon emissions, but we get a high amount of attention for them. And so it's very important that we lead at this time, especially as we're getting more and more attention focused on us.
I think what we saw with our need to balance mobility and sustainability is that we as an industry are pretty good at solving problems. Someone puts out the requirement to fly from New York to Paris. Someone puts out the requirement to do reusable space launch. We solve problems, and we do it with passion and vision and commitment.
Yeah, aviation is awesome, and we can solve these problems. There is no problem on the planet that hasn't been solved, especially when people said it's impossible. It's just a matter of time. So as aviation applies itself to this, we absolutely are solving these issues, and that's what's so exciting about aviation today, is that they're coming faster and faster, and it is super, super exciting. The ones that get to market first with more sustainable fuels, with more sustainable technology, more efficient aircraft, they're the ones that are going to lead the market. So I say, let the competition begin.
I want to touch on another thing. You talked about how the charter company you work for in London was taking aid to Ethiopia. And I think that's one of the things that's always been a hallmark of business aviation. Flying cancer patients to treatment, bringing medical supplies. I think what's interesting is we've just now come through a global pandemic where we have had to rely on business aviation to fly personal protection equipment, get tests to testing facilities, and now we're seeing taking vaccine out to people. Clearly, aviation plays an important role in our nation and our world's humanitarian efforts.
Oh yeah, aviation has sacrificed tremendously during the pandemic. People essentially flying into harm's way so that they could save other people, and that's a higher calling. I think aviation has always done that, and aviation to me symbolizes freedom, right? It's the freedom for us to transport ourselves around the planet, people and goods, and that gives us life and vitality, and it's come alive, I think, in the pandemic. While we've had industries hurting and people hurting, aviation steps in and solves it. That's, I think it's the highest purpose that we can apply ourselves to.
Well, I know that you have been doing a podcast. You're now into the podcast world. Can you talk a little bit about your podcast and how you're communicating with people and the kind of topics that you like to cover?
Yeah, Lynn and I are so excited we're in our third season of podcasting now. We've made as much as some poets, it's like not a big moneymaker, but it's such a gift to be able to talk to people and go deep for an hour or so. And really understand what motivates them. And we have this theme of second chances because we're human. We're going to die eventually, and we have all these challenges along the way. And how we overcome those challenges or get second chances in life and come back from that is really the gold. It's interesting for everybody because we all face that. And so interviewing people about how they've overcome those issues or are solving issues of the planet it's just fascinating and fun and interesting, and aviation brings us together. Maybe we should come up with a way that can really find our commonality and rise above, because we do. When we face adversity like the pandemic, we respond really well. And so I think there are hidden silver linings in things like this, and aviation is usually the first to step up. Isn't it?
And well, aviation pulls people together. Not only does it connect people physically, but it connects them emotionally as well. So as your grandfather was flying across the Atlantic, and as you were flying across the Atlantic 75 years later, there was a spirit of celebration and communication and support all the way along. You connected continents together through a single aircraft and a single person. But the hearts and minds were always connected.
That was extraordinary, and you bring up a really good point. I think when I thought, could I fly across the Atlantic like my grandfather did? And if so, what would that look like? And then I thought, this is going to work. And I worked with my partners and friends and with XPRIZE, and we sort of put this program together. And we got sponsors, so it was going to happen, and we got the airplane, and 9/11 happened. And aviation stopped. And I thought, okay, we're done. This was a great plan, a great program, but it's no longer relevant. We have a much more important thing to focus on in life. And the funny thing happened was a couple of weeks later, sponsors started coming back and saying, we think this is more important than ever, Eric. We think you really ought to do this. And so we got back going again. And it worked. And President Bush called me and congratulated me in Paris when some guy did it 75 years before, and I did it in a modern Lancair, cool airplane. So it didn't feel like it was as big a deal, but he said, you gave us something really cool to focus on with a future vision that inspired the world at a time when we have this, terrorist stuff going on. And that was huge. And I think, we're at a similar space in life right now with the pandemic. Everybody's kind of bubbling and ready to burst out. Now we're getting these vaccines. Hopefully we can really emerge strong and united and really burst into that 100-year anniversary of grandfather's flight. Okay, a little propaganda there. But really emerge from this stronger and with new businesses that are going to do extraordinary things for life here on Earth.
Well, and I do want to touch on that. Maybe that'll be a place for us to close. But I know you spent 9 years preparing for the flight to commemorate the 75th anniversary. You're now actively planning to fly for the 100th anniversary, which obviously will be 2027. What are your hopes? What are your goals on the 100th anniversary flight?
On the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's flight, I really want to use this opportunity when the globe is paying attention to have a big lever to create positive change. And I can do that in aviation. And so I'm really looking at the potential of retracing that flight again. And can we do that in a low carbon practical aircraft or a zero carbon aircraft? Big questions, and there's risk. Anytime you're trying to push the boundaries of anything, there's big risk, and people will laugh at you and, that's not practical. But we have to do stuff like that. If we're going to progress as humanity, we have to take risks. I think we can do a hybrid electric flight across the Atlantic. question is, can we pull it all together, make it work in 6 years? But we have that opportunity, so why not go for it? I don't know how many more chances I'll get in my lifetime, so let's do it now.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you are focusing on the 100th anniversary. I see you've got a 100th anniversary lapel pin on. And the important thing to me is you're recognizing it as an opportunity to use aviation to fire imaginations, to bring the world together, and to begin trying to solve problems that have felt intractable.
Yeah. You know, on the 75th anniversary when I flew across, I used it as a vision towards the future of flight, spaceflight, and we were successful. We got Spaceship One hanging in the Air and Space Museum next to the Spirit of St. Louis, and it was incredibly empowering for us as a team. It birthed the prize philanthropy industry, and it birthed the private spaceflight industry. I'm not really a space geek, so I set my sights back on electric flight as a way to solve the problems we face in aviation. And it starts small aircraft, but it'll build from there. And so really focusing on how do we make aviation clean and quiet and sustainable, low emissions. That's just been my mission for 13 years now. And these things are hard. They're incredibly hard to gin something up from nothing. But now we've got momentum behind this industry. And I think in 6 years we can do something extraordinary. And I'd love to, bring the world along. I'd love to have you come along, Ed.
Well, and I know you've talked about the importance of Europe in all of this and kind of them recognizing that we need to keep this challenge in front of us and help us find ways to find that balance between mobility, sustainability, because we know something magical happens when people from different continents and different cultures come together face to face.
This is the most important thing we can do is see and meet each other person to person. Governments, whatever, they're going to do their thing, but it's the people connecting and aviation that gives us that tool to come together and meet each other and understand that we really are one human species, and the best of the best comes from those connections. That is, thank you. I just reminding myself that it's those connections every day, and especially with Europe, because we're so close and we have such common bond. I can't wait to get there, and I hope it's before 2027 that we can open up and get back over there, because Europe is such an extraordinary continent with mountains. I hope to ski in Europe someday. That's on my bucket list. And to fly again from New York to Paris.
Oh, great. Well, Erik, I can't think of anyone more appropriate to be our keynote featured speaker for EBACE Connect. You've set a foundation, and we will look forward to staying closely in contact with you as we work together to make aviation better and to move this world forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This session has now concluded. Thank you again to our session sponsor, UAS International Trip Support. As a reminder, the recording for this session will be available to watch on demand in 24 hours in the EBACE Connect platform. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of EBACE Connect.